Hey everyone, we're here to discuss what this framework represents, and the topic being represented by this particular framework is going to be addressing habitat loss and biodiversity loss through human intervention. And we're going to kind of look at that as topic specific. And what this is we're going to be looking at clear cutting and what clear cutting and turning these clear cuts into pine plantations look like on an ecological scale, as well as a human intervention scale, and what that kind of curtails to how this cycles through. And the important thing to understand is that this is a cycle, as it can be seen in this framework right here. Now, the center point that we're focusing on is going to be the diamond directly in the center, and that's going to be what the topic is, clear cutting in pine plantations. And as you can see, this framework is a cycle, as we mentioned before, and this cycle is represented by different divisions, phases, and subdivisions of those particular divisions through each phase. And you can see that the diamond is representing two arrows off to either side. To the right, we're going to see the human interaction side increased, and that phase is going to go to the bottom, and we're going to follow those arrows along the bottom, following those divisions, and following off those particular divisions to the different shapes of subdivisions, which leads to the full-scale cycle of going to where we can see where human interactions are decreased. And these human interactions are actually decreased through the different phases that brings them to a form that makes them have to halt. And this eventually leads to regrowth, rejuvenation, and ecological recovery. But let's go through what the different phases represent and how this cycle truly works. So we're talking about clear cutting and pine plantations. We're going to go to the right and see how human interaction, when we increase these human interactions, this kind of exemplifies what goes on. So the first division and first phase of human interaction increase, we're going to see severe economical gain. And that's what these pine plantations are for. They're there for, lumber support, paper support, and structure support, giving the community these resources available through harvesting pines and through creating these pine plantations. And we can see that economical gain is branched off and subdivided into these three categories, which is lumber, paper, and structure. Now, going through economic gain, these are all divided through privately owned parcels of land that generally is bought by larger companies such as Weyerhaeuser. That's what we're going to be focusing on, which is Weyerhaeuser Paper Company. Very dominant company within this northern Mississippi region, as well as the rest of the southeast region of the United States. And now these privately owned parcels have lack of regulations through the federal government. They do have regulations, but on-site regulations they lack in that category, and it leads to people doing things a certain way, especially doing them the way that they see fit, and rather instead of being regulated on a federal level that produces a general feedback, and a general understanding of conservation and the necessity of conservation needed when doing something like this, especially on a large scale. Now, we can go from that division to the next phase, the next division of natural habitat loss. And what that leads to is we can go down and we can see that these different subdivisions of natural habitat loss they're from these man-made non-natural habitats, which leads to specialized species and opportunity for invasive species, which eventually and therefore leads to biodiversity loss and interspecies competition. Now, these three categories and these three subdivisions are super important to realize that this is the direct part of the phase that causes the direct start changing of the loop, going to human interaction increase to human interaction decrease, and how this phase actually continues through the cycle. Now, with natural habitat loss, we also experience erosion, competition loss of natural genetic biodiversity, which leads to decreased revenue opportunities and overdevelopment. Why? Because that erosion, competition, and loss in like invitation to invasive species reduces the resources available for each species within this new man-made habitat, which then kills off the habitat, which we're seeing now in northern Mississippi, like with invasive species such as pine beetle, killing these pine trees and then just creating a barren landscape, which leads to human interactions being decreased because the time needed to rejuvenate these pieces is also a process, and it takes time. But through this process, we can see a shift into the native species beginning to reappear with less competition between species, which is subdivided into more resources now readily available for the native species rather than invasive species, which leads to ecological value becomes more prevalent, than what the economical value is for the human, because we're no longer pumping economical value out of these select privately owned parcels. We're seeing more ecological value come from them, from the rejuvenation and reinstitution or reinstating of the native species that were previously found before human interaction, which leads to biodiversity being protected. But then that phases right back out to once we have this ecologically restored area, these private parcels and private companies come in and they do the same thing. So it's a framework of natural repeat cycles, and we need to focus more on what the conservation side of this is going to be, and that's what we're going to be addressing later on throughout the topic.